let's go ahead and get started. Welcome everybody. This is the Equitable TOD Strategies session. And we're live streaming this session, which is part of why we were waiting to get that going online. So welcome to everybody in the room and welcome to those of you who are joining us online. My name is Lindsay Lecour and I'll be moderating this session. My connection to this topic is I work for a multifamily developer based here in Miami, and we've done a lot of TOD development over the years. We've built 3,300 units on TODs here on the Metro Rail and bus lines in Miami-Dade County. So I'll show you some pretty pictures of those a little bit later on. But I'd like each panelist to introduce themselves.
Hi, I'm Sidney Douse. I am a transit planner with the Atlanta Regional Commission, which is Atlanta's MPO, also their Council of Governments, Area Agency on Aging, and a bunch of other titles, but I'm happy to be here.
Hi, my name is Taylor Marcantel. I'm a planning program manager with Houston Metro. Part of my job is helping Metro reimagine its joint development and transit-oriented development program. The other part is managing capital projects, like expanding our BRT system, and some of that includes TOD-related planning.
Good morning. Well, I'm from the West Coast. Good afternoon here in Miami. Ian Carlton, and I'm a lifelong student of sustainable urban development, and I think of sustainability in terms of the 3 E's, so equity, environment, and economy. And I also am an adjunct professor of planning and equitable development with students at Portland State University and the University of Oregon, where I help them understand how real estate development interacts with public policy, and that's actually what I do in my day job. I run a software company that helps people understand how real estate development interests would react to public policy. And I moved to Portland, Oregon, and met up with a firm there, ECONorthwest, which is a planning, finance, and economics firm, where we apply the software and the tools to help transit agencies and others think about how public policies inform real estate development outcomes and equitable development.
Great, thank you. So we're hoping to make this more of a conversation today, and we hope that you as audience members will participate. There are microphones on either side, and some folks in back can help you reach those. And then folks online also, please put your questions in the chat. We do have people here who will bring those questions to the microphone for the group. So with that, I think we're ready to get started. And you know, when we first started planning for this session, my first question was, what do you mean when you say equitable development? So maybe we can start just with some definitions and maybe how that might be seen differently by different stakeholders. Ian, you want to kick that off?
Sure. So we work with a lot of different levels of government, private sector actors, and I would say in each engagement, we find ourselves redefining what is meant by equitable TOD in that context amongst those stakeholders. Very often, multiple stakeholders will have their own internal definition that they bring to the table, and we have to work with them to find ways for those two definitions to work together. And sometimes we have people who come to the conversation fresh without any clue of what we mean by equitable TOD, and we introduce the concept to them through case studies and narratives, and ultimately we generally end up at a definition that involves both process and outcomes. And as far as process, we're talking about engaging with communities that are historically underrepresented, and we are working on outcomes that work to redress inequities and to identify disparities in that process, and in these equitable outcomes, we hope that we bend that curve towards a more equitable and just society.
Thank you. And I know we're going to talk a little bit more about the process later on, but I think it might make sense for us to give some examples of outcomes, some successful outcomes in terms of equitable development. And I know that Taylor and Sidney and I also have some examples to share with you. So do you want to show us some examples you've seen, Taylor?
Sure, I can do that. So, yeah, let me go back one. And before I start, I just want to kind of echo what you were saying. about process. I think for Metro, when we're talking about equitable development, whether it's joint development or TOD partnerships outside of our properties, it really is about a process for developing near transit in a way that meets the diverse needs of the community, especially those underserved or vulnerable populations. So what I'm going to show you first is an example of, I guess you could call it TOD 1.0 with Metro. This is an older TOD, but it's one of the examples of TOD that we do have, and it's a joint development project with Metro and with a private developer. So this probably looks familiar to a lot of you. It's kind of a prototypical TOD development. In the back you have a park and ride facility that Metro operates, and then on the kind of the right side of your screen you see something called a High Line, which is apartments that are market rate, and then on the left side is more of the commercial, the restaurants, shopping, and services. So that's kind of what we've done in the past. What we're transitioning to is equitable development. What I'm going to show you is not going to be all Metro projects. A lot of the development that's been happening around equitable TOD in Houston has been privately led development. So this is New Hope Housing on Harrisburg. It's on one of our rail lines. And this is actually mixed-use transitional housing for people transitioning from homelessness. So this is an example of equitable TOD in Houston. It's still fairly new. This is another mixed-use transit-oriented development near our another one of our rail lines, Village at Palm Center. This is a little bigger of a site, and it has a mixture of types of residents. So you see more of what you might associate with a sort of mid-rise TOD, but it also kind of tapers off and has more townhouse-style development, so it offers a range of lifestyles. This is a project, again, along a rail line. This is actually, I guess you would call this like a public-public partnership. We're working with the city of Houston. They are trying to add affordable housing units near one of our transit centers. And so we're working with them to design this in a way that really activates our transit center and encourages transit use, and also provides affordable housing near transit.
Great, thanks Taylor. Sydney, you want to?
Thank you. And for another ETOD definition, our largest operator, MARTA, has a definition that basically focuses on what the former director said. We usually think about the lines. Transit is lines and dots, dots being the stops. TOD is a focus on those dots. And how can we create a system where everybody can reach their jobs, retail, recreation, visit family, live well, and get to all of those places using transit. And that is their broad definition of equitable TOD. And the first example that I'll show is the Edgewood Candler Park MARTA station. It's on the east line of our heavy rail system. And this is unique, and I picked this one because I work for the MPO, and we helped to fund several studies on this area about 10, 12 years ago. We funded a study, a small area plan, then we convened planners, experts in coordination with MARTA to have a charrette around this site to envision what would a TOD development look like and how could it be equitable. And after that study, MARTA then partnered and sought RFPs for development based on the site plan that was created through the process that we got going. And I guess what's rare for a planner is that construction started not too long after the plan was done. Picture that. And construction has taken place, and at this point, this project is almost, or actually just completed its final phase. 2 apartment buildings, each of them have a certain percentage of affordable units. During the rezoning process, The community really pushed for a community-based youth development organization, Moving in the Spirit, that trains youth focused on dance, and they housed them at the site as well. And also we got a good amount of parks and green space included as well. So that really served as a good process of regional cooperation and coordination with our transit authority. I hit the wrong button. Another example that's not housing, MARTA did start something called the MARTA Market, targeted at food deserts or places that don't have quick access within that famous quarter mile to fresh food from their stations. They partnered with the CFM, Community Farmers Markets, and this organization locally gets local food from local growers in the area, and MARTA has been able to set up stalls at these stations so people can get produce before boarding or after boarding the train. It runs every year. You can see here the schedule as shown. It's been pretty successful. I think they're in their second or third year. And I live near one of these stations, and I actually did not realize that it's all local produce. I probably should support them more. But this is one program that they have, and they also accept SNAP, EBT, and other forms of subsidized assistance for the shoppers as well. So it's rare that the local produce is actually affordable for a change. And another non-housing or economic example, there is a larger program called Soccer in the Streets, and they partnered with MARTA back in 2016 to start what they call Station Soccer. And they are putting soccer fields on the MARTA stations. It sounded weird to me, but it actually works. And the first station, it's the photo on your right, is at our central station, 5 points, built in the 70s, very 70s style architecture. If you can look, there was a courtyard that I did not even know existed, and that's where they put the field. It's sort of up high. And the picture in the middle is the West End station where it's going right under the tracks. But they partnered with this nonprofit to promote soccer and at the same time promote transit usage. There are different leagues in different areas around the city. Our MPO actually had a team, maybe for 1 year, I think it lasted, played a few games. And now there's sort of a league of stations as shown, and different teams can travel by transit around for different soccer matches and tournaments, and that has been a success as well. And the final example from my end, this is the College Park MARTA station, really close to my house. And this is the last line before the airport. It's right next to a small main street of College Park. And across the street, right in front of the MARTA station, you can sort of see it on the aerial, was a church, First United Methodist Church of College Park. Due to airport expansion, exurban, suburban flight, the church started to lose membership. Most of the homes have been bought out and moved. So the church was always trying to find a way to either utilize some of their campus, because this was a church, had almost a school building, a Sunday school building, and the church. So they ended up sort of starting a partnership with Push Push Theater. That is a local artist development and support organization. They do plays, they have artist space, and so forth. They partner with them and with Tapestry Development to actually make this sort of an art-driven TOD site. And the church is going to remain, but Push Push moved their local headquarters to this site. They're creating retail space on the bottom, and which can often be a challenge with TOD. Artist space on the top, a theater, housing for artists on the site, and then across the street in what used to be their parking lot, you can see the lot sort of next to Hotel Indigo. I'm not sure how easy that is to see. Tapestry Development is building an affordable multifamily unit right there. So this is TOD that's actually not on MARTA's property, but is right up against it. So it's creating a unique TOD right there on site with the other developments that have taken place. And right across the tracks is College Park's Main Street. And they're they started construction over the summer, and things are going pretty well.
I think that's me, thank you. So I'll show you a few examples of what we've done here in Miami-Dade County. I think we're in a unique position where the Department of Transit and Public Works owns a lot of land around their Metro Rail stations. And so we've been working with them for many years to develop housing at their stations. This is actually under construction today. This is Block 45, and it's right next to the Overtown Metro Rail Station and the Brightline Terminus in Miami. And this will be 616 units of market rate and workforce housing. So 360 of the units in this building will be set aside for people earning up to 140% of the area median income. So on the affordable and workforce side of things, we define rents by income levels, and typically people earning between 80 and 140% of the area median income are considered to be the workforce, at least in Miami-Dade County, and those that are below the 80% bright line would be more considered affordable housing. So this should be done by the end of 2025, and we'll also have a parking garage and ground floor retail, all in the Overtown neighborhood of Miami. This is the Audrey M. Edmondson Transit Village on Northwest 7th Avenue, which is a main bus arterial in Liberty City in Miami. We built about 200 units of affordable housing for families and elderly here. This is a slightly lower income population, at or below 80% of the area median income. We also built a 5-bus bay transit center for Miami-Dade Transit. You can see the bus coming out of that right there in the image. And then we also partnered with the Cultural Affairs Department to put a 200-seat black box theater there that's operated by Fantasy Theater Factory. So they run community-based arts and arts programming and theater from this development. This is Northside Transit Village, and I'll put in a shameless plug. If anyone's interested in walking this site, tomorrow we will be offering one of the mobile tours will come up to Northside Transit Village. So this will eventually be built out to 600 apartments right on the Metro Rail, the Northside Metro Rail station, and also has bus linkages as well. So this is housing for families and for seniors. So we have quite a number of apartments here that are set aside for seniors, 55 plus, and is also entirely affordable. So with some ground floor retail. It's another view from the Metro Rail platform looking at the part of the development. And this is coming north out of the Overtown Transit Village station, looking north at the Beacon in Miami. So that's in between Overtown Transit Village and the Culmer Metro Rail station. Also entirely affordable, and it has ground floor daycare program that runs for after-school programs, things like that. So I think with that, before we keep going, I'm wondering if anybody from the audience has any questions or examples you've seen of successful equitable TODs, or questions based on anything you've seen thus far. Or if there are any questions from those of you joining us online, feel free to just jump up there. No need to. Yep, go ahead.
One question. In the examples in the cities we've talked about thus far, are the tax incentives for the affordable housing, is it all of the federal programs, or are there also specific local programs that either you've used in Miami, Atlanta?
Good question.
I know a little bit more about Houston because I'm from there, but
yeah. So these developments that are primarily geared towards the low-income population, affordable housing, do leverage the low-income housing tax credit program. In addition to a number of other sort of public sources of funds from the state, the county, the city. So I think the one that I showed you that has the theater had 10 different sources in that capital stack. So, you know, not for the faint of heart, but I guess it's a good example of how, you know, multiple different authorities having jurisdiction come together to make something like this happen. It's really the only way to make it happen when you have such deep skewed rents. Thanks for that question. Any other questions before we keep going? Okay. So we've shown some examples of success stories or things that have been built thus far. I know there are still a lot of obstacles out there to building these equitable TODs. Can we share some of those that you've run across maybe? And I'd like to hear from the audience too if you're facing something that you'd be willing to share.
I guess I'll start. So I think in Houston we have a lot of, I guess you would call them like high opportunity areas, like places that are transit rich, have a lot of amenities near them, and we have a metro property kind of in the middle of that. I guess challenge with, or obstacle, whatever you want to call it, with sites like that is there are a lot of stakeholders involved in building consensus around that. Even as we're just now starting to rethink our approach to joint development, it's already evident that consensus building amongst stakeholders is going to be a major challenge. People have different visions for certain places. So on the stakeholder side, it's a challenge. And then in sites like that, as well as in other parts of the city, you have sort of fear of displacement. And I think that's a major challenge, and Metro has work to do to build trust with the community, to let them know this really is going to be a community-driven process. So what you may have seen in the past the outcomes may be different, and we actually want to work with communities. So I think that consensus building is one of our major challenges going forward with Equitable TOD.
And Ian, I know you have a framework for that. I don't know if you want to share that now or.
Sure.
Yeah,
Wanna go to the
let
next
me
slide?
get you there. Oops.
Yeah, so we have worked on a number of projects. This one with the Purple Line Corridor Coalition arrived to us relatively fully baked. So after years and years of meeting a coalition of community groups and member-driven conversations, they came with a scope of work to understand how they could achieve their goals. And they came with the three-legged sort of approach, looking at transit itself as a infrastructure backbone to their work, economic growth around that, business retention being a part of that, real estate development, affordable housing being a critical part of that. And this coalition came with their asks and wanted to know what the market could deliver and how much value could be captured to deliver on these goals. And so we worked with them to sort of put numbers to that, to quantify what's possible. And I would say one of the biggest obstacles that we face is outsized expectations of what the market can deliver when it comes to TOD in general, and then with Equitable TOD and those goals in particular. So this approach, we find it occurring across the country, where more and more people are creating these collaborative tables, engaging the community in discussions. It's incredibly helpful and powerful for generating ideas and consensus around what Equitable TOD is. And if you go to the next slide, we've worked in other cities where they're also asking similar questions and setting the table, maybe being led more by, in this case, a city agency, city government, looking to understand with new transit investment what the market could provide on its own so that they can start to think about how they fill in the gaps and how you can achieve goals along a corridor that might otherwise not be fulfilled by the market, might actually be contradicted by market actions if left to their own devices. And so these are some examples of sort of obstacles, but also some great community-led and government-led initiatives to try to get out in front of that and try to produce strategies to achieve their economic, environmental, and equity goals.
You mentioned, we've been caught in some of those traps sometimes when we've tried to develop, and the zoning may require, for example, you know, ground floor, a certain amount of ground floor retail or commercial space at, you know, on these TODs, and at a lot of them, the market didn't support that, and so they're sitting, you know, they're sitting vacant, or we're trying to be creative about how to address that, but that's maybe one example where the zoning has a good intentions of putting a policy in place, but in reality, when we built it, we've struggled a little bit to fill those.
And to add to that, in general, retail seems to be always the tough portion. And in the Atlanta area, especially the stations where you don't have the gentrification and the economic activity, it is hard to get that retail in place. And we actually worked with one of the cities on the station that has a huge site where they've been waiting for a grocery store or anything for a while. It may start to happen, but we actually went into their code and we actually pulled back the retail restrictions and made that only right at the station within that quarter mile or less, and the areas further out we became a little bit looser so they could put housing in. I think sometimes that fear in the code is that everything that is mixed use has to be retail on the ground floor, but really you can design a site as long as your setbacks are close, you have a good street network, you can have a single use block or half a block and it still be successful. So we had to fine tune it so that it would fit better.
Does anyone from the audience have questions or obstacles they're facing that they want to share? Please come on up to the microphone.
Good afternoon. My name's Scudder Wag. I'm with Jarrett Walker & Associates. I'm a consultant in bus network planning, and I'm very interested in thinking about bus systems and TOD and development that's centered around those. And I guess I have an example from a smaller place than Houston or Miami, where the city is redeveloping a large plot in a formerly industrial sort of area. And the developers come in, they're going to reconnect streets, they're doing all sorts of wonderful things, making an obvious opportunity for the bus network to be improved by straightening out a lot of things, but they won't allow that because the developer doesn't want buses in the center of their big new development with lots of affordable housing. So what kind of advice might you have for advocates in communities like that where the transit first message hasn't quite gotten there yet, like it has maybe in Houston and Miami?
Any responses to that?
I mean, I don't think we figured it out in Houston. Yeah. I mean, maybe we're further along, but we still have those challenges. And I don't know if the site you're talking about, if it's like if it was a joint development, Metro could have maybe negotiating power. But if it's just a TOD kind of on its own, I don't know. I don't really have a good answer. I think that's kind of.
I was going to say your question hits home for me because we're facing this exact same challenge right now, where as we're all coming back online from the pandemic, and we're starting to see the downtown become full and active and vibrant again, and buses are running again, and how do they cadence those buses? Transit rightly wants them as close to the stops waiting, and so they can go through. We're trying to underwrite retail rent on that frontage. That's our main and main. So it's challenging, and I think we're trying to look at some creative solutions of can we move that bus route a block south to come back over? Are there other maybe publicly owned spaces that are underutilized? I don't know if you've noticed here, but we have underneath the I-95 corridor, there's a lot of space that's currently used for storage. We have a skate park now, which is exciting, but maybe that's the space we could utilize for this. So great question. I wish we had.
I might be the contrarian and just say that, would you want a bus depot in your front yard, backyard, next door? I think sometimes through these community engagements we learn a lot from people, and perhaps there would be alternative ideas that might come out of that conversation that isn't centered on trying to keep a bus depot in that particular location. Yeah, I mean, even routes for that matter. You know, can conversations lead you to an alternative? As you said, finding the next street over. Perhaps it's a conversation about what types of buses these are. Perhaps this neighborhood would prefer to have a brand new federally funded hydrogen bus that has zero emissions and is incredibly quiet and removes some of the impacts on the community. So, you know.
Another question from an online participant.
Thank you. This is a question about affordable housing. To what extent are you partnering with market rate developers to develop a mix of income ranges? And are you offering incentives to market rate developers? And there's another piece of this. Have there been any issues with mixed income building with pushback or trouble filling the market rate units? So what does that mix look like and how is it really working or not working?
So a question for the transit folks.
So some of the developments I showed, and I had to look back and check myself, but most of the sites around the MARTA stations, the incentive is that basically to either to build on MARTA's property, and from the city side to build within, they have a Beltline overlay district, which is a planned transit route, is currently a trail that goes around the city. In order to build within that area, you have to have a certain percentage set aside. So really, it's not that where you can do the base level of development, and to do more, you have to do affordable housing. It is simply required. And then from a demand standpoint, some of these areas, there is such a demand for housing and for rent, and some of these areas are so popular. From what I have observed, I have not seen them having any trouble getting the market rate to come as well. The fight will be keeping that affordability and keeping that percentage there. On the opposite, on the south side and the areas where the development hasn't really caught on yet, you have half the community that wants affordable housing and another half that says we already have enough affordable housing. So it's looking ahead to say, hey, things are going to change. We need to preserve the housing that we have at this site. But so far, it does seem like the mixes are going pretty well, and I think we'll be able to tell over the next few years.
From Houston, or from the metro perspective in Houston, the projects that we've been doing with joint development have mainly been either mostly affordable or entirely affordable, or mostly market rate. So we don't have a lot of history doing mixed income. That's the direction we want to head. But some active projects we have are the public-public partnership with the city, which would be mostly affordable. And then there's the Southeast Transit Center with the County Housing Authority that would be for seniors. But it's not, again, those are not really mixed. So I think that's going to be a learning curve for us, identifying those opportunities and then getting those projects through the, for lack of a better word, scoping phase and negotiation, and through the whole engagement process.
And I would just add that in at least the work that we've done here in Miami, typically it does fall into two different models. It's either the low-income housing tax credit model, which drives you to be 100% affordable to folks at 80% of the area median income or below, or you're a market rate development and you're sort of buying down the rent. In our case with the Block 45, the 600 units at the Brightline terminus, the county has has asked us to restrict, more than half of those units to be affordable to the workforce population, and we can do that because the county is giving us land at below market value. So that's one of the incentives they're giving us. We're also in a CRA. We're in an opportunity zone, so there are some other incentives and hopefully tax increment financing incentives that we can take advantage if the community wants to buy those rents down even further. So right now we're really at the high end of the workforce scale because we're just based on where we ended up right now. But there are ways to buy those rents down if we can access some of these other incentives that were in discussions currently. So I think, yeah, go ahead.
I had two questions, if that's fair. One on community space, indoor community space in the developments, and then a second one, Ian, you kind of got to this earlier about defining equity. So the first one, do you have examples of how you've funded and then maybe maintained kind of an open community space in any of these indoor community space in any developments that you worked with? And then on the equity side of things, can you give an example of maybe when you had an inability to gain consensus on definition and how you handled of equity and how you've handled that? Thank you.
Anyone want to take a shot at one or both of those? I mean, I can answer the community, from my perspective, the community space. So we have community space in all of our developments. And are you talking about public space where people can come in, or more for the residents that live there?
It would be more for the residents. The community-based organizations we've worked with have demanded it. And,
Right.
But it could be for the residents as well. I think it probably available for rent, or maybe even free for a knitting group, card
Yeah.
group, something like that. Yep.
Yeah, okay. I mean, so again, in the one model with using the low-income housing tax credit, we can build what's called community service facilities using that financing. So as long as we provide that space at a cost to the community that is affordable to low-income population, free, or then we get free equity to build that space, essentially. So there's some good incentives there at the federal level to get that kind of community service and community facility space built out.
In terms of community space, there was the example, the Edgewood Candler Park station, that dance center, the moving in the spirit, that was actually something that the community asked for. I guess sort of something that youth from outside the area and inside the area could use sort of as a space and so forth. That's one, I guess, programmatic example. And the College Park development, they are proposing a large green space. I'm not sure if it's going to be public or private, but they do have it laid out there, and we'll have to see as it's built what happens. And then in terms of consensus, what we've seen lately, I guess the NIMBYism you may get for certain developments, you can't tell if it's in opposition to the density or the affordability that's going to come with the developments. And it's right now, affordability is such a regional issue, you sort of hear the density fight. But we've had a few TODs that have not gone off the ground because the neighborhood was not in support of what was happening. There's one site where residential didn't go, but then the city stepped up and said, hey, we'll put our city hall here on this site instead. That actually may be better, a different type of use right there on the site. And that was an interesting situation because you had 3 multifamily developments from about a half mile out in already built. And then when they wanted to build right on the site, right at the station, that's where they got the pushback. So I'm not sure if that's a density threshold type of thing or knowing what could happen there, but it happens.
Yeah, and I would say that I have never worked on a project where there was consensus about the definition, but you reach a point at which the group becomes comfortable with moving forward, and you just are going to have to be used to ambiguity in this space. I think even when we are approached by someone who's already been through a long process of community engagement and they have a well-formed idea, we ask them to spend some time with us, giving us the lay of the land. Who are those who were opposed to this conversation? You know, who were the naysayers? Who has concerns and they are skeptical about the process and about the actors involved? Where does the distrust lie? Because it always exists. we are all humans, so.
So I want to turn to inclusionary zoning, because that's part of what our title is today. And, I think to start, and I don't think I realized this, that there are some jurisdictions out there in the country that prohibit inclusionary zoning, or at least mandatory inclusionary zoning. Taylor, I think you work in one of them. And, I don't know if you want to speak to why that exists or how it's been.
Yeah.
working.
Well, I mean, so there's a statewide ban on mandatory inclusionary zoning in Texas. There are examples of opt-in or sort of incentive-based programs around inclusionary zoning. Houston and Harris County, kind of the core of our region, does not have those.
Or zoning at all.
We don't, we famously do not have zoning. But I will say, because, perhaps because of that, planners and the planning community in Houston have figured out ways to do some of the things that zoning is intended to do. So with TOD, we recently passed TOD ordinance that while we can't regulate the land use, we can regulate the way that it looks. So setbacks, sidewalks, the overall pedestrian experience. That program started out as an opt-in program in certain corridors that were high-frequency transit corridors. And then it's evolved to be mandatory. Certain things are mandatory. So I think while we may not have inclusionary ordinance type language right now, that could change in the future. I think people are pretty creative when it comes to trying to tackle those issues.
And I know, Sydney, you mentioned earlier that there are some actual mandatory inclusionary zoning elements in your region. You want to talk about some of those?
Yeah, and it's, I mentioned some of it before, it's mandatory within certain zones. So zooming out, the city requires a certain percentage of affordable housing within the Beltline overlay, and also within a district called the West Side neighborhoods. That's about maybe 5% of the city, but it's a rapidly growing area. So they've been able to get it in those places. And MARTA, on the land that they control, as a board, they require a percentage on any development on their sites, and then they just voted that within, where there's a station within a designated opportunity zone, the affordable percentage, I think, goes from a 10% to a 20%. So within certain areas, it's inclusionary. It's not that typical citywide inclusionary requirement yet. And some of these changes are recent, and there's a lot of development happening, so we're going to be curious to see how this pans out over time.
And what are the preliminary reactions from the developer community?
I think so far they've been okay. And again, I think there's been such a demand for multifamily housing, and there's such an interest in these areas that they've been willing to do it. I think it probably would have been different 10 years ago, but they've been okay so far.
And are you primarily seeing private developers coming in, wanting to build market rate housing and agreeing to,
Yes.
comply with the affordable, and then just operating that all together under one umbrella?
Yes, typically under one umbrella. Sometimes the city will manage the percentages, sometimes MARTA will. And another thing that's been unique, there are several stations that are next to former public housing sites that through Hope 6 were redeveloped as mixed income as well. So you sort of have that adjacency also, and then you're adding to it with the additional housing.
Okay, great. Any other examples of mandatory inclusionary zoning people want to speak to or ask questions about? I also want to talk about voluntary inclusionary zoning and success stories on that front. I know, Ian, you have a few to share. Do you want to?
Sure. We have one question, though.
Oh,
Hi, thank you. I'm from Texas, so I definitely understand the struggles around prohibiting inclusionary zoning. I was curious if any of you guys could speak to getting a transit agency or a city on board when there's not a requirement for affordable housing, but we know that that's the direction that we need to move towards.
I can speak because I think that's a real opportunity in Houston, is for the transit agency to say, hey, we have these properties that we would like to bite off for joint development, and then we would go through the engagement process. You know, I'm sure there will be some where affordable housing would be a good location, but I think that's an opportunity, a big opportunity in Houston to introduce affordable housing near transit is at our facilities, because we don't have that inclusionary language in our code.
Also, I would say here in Miami, the public housing and community development arm of the county works pretty closely with the Department of Transit and us private developers to, you know, provide some of that subsidy I was talking about that helps get those projects off the ground. And so, in fact, in several of the examples that I've shared, both of those agencies are involved. So, you know, that's helped us provide more deeper rent restriction and rents for people. Did you have?
Well, I just wanted to talk about the market-based reality of inclusionary, because that was one of the topics we wanted to cover. And we tend to do this with almost every client we work with, because it's sort of foundational understanding to be able to begin a conversation about where inclusionary can work, where it cannot, and how to maximize your goals, you know? And so on the slide here, I mentioned that we have software. We designed this to help people understand and appreciate market realities. I don't think you're seeing the slide, but when you do,
Hint, hint.
what we look at is the combination of a few major inputs into real estate development. Real estate development is about revenues and costs. And costs vary over geographies a little bit, you know, from California to Texas, different costs, but also from one side of LA to the other side of LA, different costs. And on the revenue side, we have places where people are willing to pay different amounts to live in that location or to work in that location. And if we can just agree on that people are willing to pay different amounts to be in different places, and we can agree that there's different construction costs, then we get these maps. These maps are showing the results of real estate pro formas for where something like a quadplex is feasible on the left-hand side across the Portland metro area, and on the right-hand side across Los Angeles, greater Los Angeles. And we can also then take that to the next level, which is what about other product types that have potentially different demand for them and different costs? And you get different geographies where the market can deliver product at that cost and that revenue. So when we talk about inclusionary, what we're talking about is taking what the market would pay for a location and setting aside some of the units at a lower rate, which means less revenue to the developer relative to the unfettered market. So in the next map, I'm going to take you further south. This is San Diego. And on the left-hand side, you have a map where we've taken this premise to its next logical conclusion, which is that if you have developers developing different sized buildings in different parts of the city, those different buildings can outcompete one another for land. And so in the yellow area on the map on the left are areas where a woody walk-up, a 3-story surface-parked apartment building would pencil and win the bidding war for land. Even if you were allowed to build a tower there, an apartment developer building a 3-story building would be able to pay more for land than they could. In the green, you have areas where a 4/1, a podium-style, more urban development with parking underneath, takes up less land area, is more intense but more costly to build. That's where it would win the bidding war for land. And then blue is where towers would win the bidding war for land. Now there's obviously plenty of policies that prevent a tower from appearing in a lot of the places you see that are blue, but this is the unfettered market reality. And on the right-hand side of this, you can see what happens when we take all those buildings and we require a developer to take 20% of the units and set them aside at 60% of the area median income so that they take less revenue than they would have had they let the market decide the rents. And what you can see is that the yellow area is smaller, the blue area is smaller, but also that we're changing the shades of colors in places where, in some places where you once could build a podium or a tower style development with that requirement and the lower revenue, one cannot cover the construction costs in the same geographies. And so this is sort of the market reality of inclusionary. And then when we work with cities like Austin, Texas, in this case, where we've gone in and our software allows us to look parcel by parcel at what might be most feasible and where, in the case of Texas, a voluntary bonus might be valuable enough to a developer that they would deliver inclusionary units, we can then say, here are the markets where you can require more or less. And you can get a map like on the right-hand side, which was a proposed and not adopted policy that responded to their goal of maximizing inclusionary housing. And to maximize inclusionary housing, you would look market by market, submarket by submarket, and figure out where people are willing to pay and how much you could ask. But that's a very complicated policy. As you can see, this map is about different shades of coloring, meaning different inclusionary requirements. So difficult to administer, potentially. But not as difficult as places that have really gone to the fullest extent of trying to maximize inclusionary housing. This is an image of Arlington, Virginia, where in Virginia, unlike some states, you do not have to have a zoning code that matches your general plan. So you can have a zoning code that only allows something like a single-family home right next to a transit station, and then tell people with your general plan you'd like a tower there. And then when they come knocking on your door, seeking the right to build a tower, you get to negotiate with them on a one-off basis for what public benefits you would like in each and every building. And so in those circumstances, which exist in many parts of the world, the government gets to negotiate exactly what the maximum inclusionary might be. But that's also incredibly difficult to administer and requires a tremendous trust in government. If you would want to know more about the economics of inclusionary development, I helped author a guide from the Urban Land Institute called The Economics of Inclusionary Zoning, where we go into more depth about this. But this is fundamental information that we bring to a conversation where people want inclusionary to be the simple, easy, costless solution, at least costless to the government agency, to deliver some affordable housing, particularly near transit. And we talk with them about what the market could deliver and what their expectations should be.
Right, so when you had that image of San Diego up and showed the impact, I mean, I guess it's safe to say that by applying the deeper skewed rents to 20%, would it be correct to say you're reducing the overall density that would be built? Is that, I think what you're saying is product type changes because as you get more dense, it's more expensive to build. But I think the other takeaway is that there are less units to build overall. Is that?
Potentially, and that is one reason that many governments hear from their constituents, particularly real estate developers, who say, do not implement an inclusionary zoning policy. We will not be able to build in this location or this community. And as the maps demonstrate, that's true. The marginal development, might be lost outright. You might not be able to build it, or it might be a smaller scale. But there are things that can be done. There are incentives that can counteract this map. There are policies that can come into play. And so that's the next discussion is, do you have the wherewithal to step up and help the development community deliver the maximum amount of density that you want near transit while also delivering that inclusionary housing?
And as the market advocate here, how do you, when people say, well, we don't need inclusionary zoning because let demand and supply work its way out the way it should, how do you respond to that? Is building more housing at whatever income level going to help address the need for affordable housing on the lower end of the spectrum?
Well, it depends on your goals. And if you're a community that has zero funds to dedicate to affordable housing, then inclusionary zoning may create infinitely more affordable housing than you would otherwise get, right? I mean, you're going from zero to something. But yes, there are also the sort of counterfactuals. You might have had significantly more housing built at market rates had the inclusionary policy not been in place. And those are things that communities need to weigh. So I don't go into the conversation with a preconceived idea. I am working on behalf of people who want certain things, and we talk with them about how to achieve their goals. And sometimes inclusionary housing works with their goals, and sometimes it runs counter to their goals. And so it is a conversation. And
Sure.
yeah.
Are there other questions from the audience or from our virtual attendees regarding inclusionary zoning, or other examples or questions from speakers before we move on? Any examples of things that work well in your municipalities or challenges that have arisen from inclusionary zoning? Okay, so I think we can move on to other policies that move the needle on equitable development at TODs. And I think we've talked about this, looking at it through a framework of, at the federal level, state level, regional level, city level. Taylor, I know you had an example at the federal level that we were discussing.
Sure. So, like I mentioned, I work on our JD TOD program. I also work on capital projects. And when we're looking to pursue federal funding, oftentimes we are looking at the FTA's Capital Investment Grants program, the CIG program. I'm sure most of you are familiar with it. That is a competitive program, and part of the rating is related to land use and economic development. So essentially, that rating has kind of forced more of a discussion for our projects and for Metro in general, and really advanced the discussion around TOD when we're doing corridor level investments. So we have some major BRT projects, and as we're moving those projects through the pipeline, we're now looking at TOD earlier to see what are the opportunities, what can we anticipate that might help us make the case for the project, and also actually help implement TOD along those corridors. So that's one way the federal policy kind of has trickled down for us.
Great. Other things?
Well, I'll say that has been a sea change. When we saw that implemented just less than 10 years ago now, the conversations with transit planners, engineers changed overnight because they pay attention to things like whether or not they can get $1 billion from the federal government. And I think that the federal government is taking new steps, additional steps now to further the conversation. So we've heard about initiatives here. The federal government is stepping in and thinking about how engagement can be funded potentially through federal programs. And that's going to be clarified, I understand, from, is Maria Zimmerman in the room? She tells us in a prior session that will be clarified soon. Whether engagement can become a qualified expense, and you could pay participants from the community to join conversations and compensate them for that time. And we have requirements now at the federal level for Justice 40, which is a program and initiative that 40% of funds coming out of DOT be spent in areas that are meet a certain set of criteria for communities of color, communities that are underrepresented, indigenous communities, and that is also going to probably send a clear message to many people in the room from the federal government about the conversation and widening it to others. And then lastly, I have to point out that there is an initiative within the federal government to require that metropolitan planning organizations begin to make sure that their representatives, the decision makers, are representative of communities of color. And that's an incredibly important step, one step, because when you think about the system plans that are put forward by an MPO, those set the priorities of where transit investments are going to be, and as you said, where the lines and dots go on the map. And I think there's a potential pitfall here, which is that many of those plans were passed 30 years ago when the representation on MPO boards was not what we hope it to be in the future. And so we probably need to revisit those plans and think about our priorities, because putting those dots on maps is an incredibly important part of this equitable TOD conversation.
Sure. Question?
I have two from our virtual attendees. The first one is, with some building codes now allowing taller wood-framed buildings, what impacts are expected or have been observed on equitable TOD? For example, are developers more open to offering even more subsidized units or community amenities than they had been with older versions of the building codes?
And that was building codes allowing taller, what buildings? Wood frame buildings,
Yep.
okay. I don't know much about that as a Florida developer, so maybe. We gotta build everything in concrete down here.
Welcome to Florida.
Have you looked at that?
Yeah, we've looked into it.
Okay. From the regional standpoint, we haven't really gotten into that yet, but I know there's been limits on height with wood frame, and that's been the preferred mode, but I haven't really looked at the change yet, not sure if you have.
Yeah, it's something that, as someone from Portland, we talk about a lot. The timber industry is an important industry in the Pacific Northwest. And it's really in its early days, but the hope is that timber frame construction can provide you an opportunity to go taller. And right now there is this sort of gap in the construction cost world where above about 85 feet, you suddenly are needing to build in concrete or heavy steel, iron. And at that point, it becomes much more costly. And so you tend across the United States not see buildings that are in the 8 to 12-story range. A goal would be that timber begins to fill that gap, that it's something that can be priced to fill that gap, so that these maps that I showed you that are based on revenues and costs change, fundamentally change. At this time, it's still a new technology that's delivering on faster project timelines, but not on cheaper costs overall. And we hope that with mass production and more and more firms understanding how to plan, and it requires a lot of advanced planning all of these timber buildings, you would see the cost come down. So right now they're at parity with concrete, but if it becomes cheaper than concrete, we could see a sea change in where it becomes economical to build.
I would also add that another thing to think about as you can go higher and add more density, the parking also becomes an issue, because as you're putting more people on that same footprint, are you having to then start building structured parking, which is a big drag on the pro forma. Obviously, transit-oriented development, and why we do so much of it on the affordable and workforce side is, a lot of our residents don't have to own a car. And they live at a metro rail station, they don't own a car. Transit loves the increased ridership, and people on a limited means save a lot of money a month. So just an ancillary thought to, as we're going higher and more dense, do people have cars? So we're talking about other policies that might move the needle. What about moving down from the federal level to the state level? I can talk a little bit about, the low-income housing tax credit program is a federal program, but it's allocated through state allocating agencies, those agencies typically prioritize transit-oriented development. So they're giving you more points to be closer to buses, fixed rail, things like that. So that's an example of a state policy that's set at the state that encourages TODs.
Well, I'll add, you asked for a list, so I brought a list. Kelly is laughing at me. Shifting dollars from within state DOTs to transit is an obvious one. And shifting attention within state DOTs to transit requires a sea change in many DOTs. But we're seeing it happen. We're even seeing in the highway departments now discussions, for example, in California about using transit as a standard mitigation for a highway intervention. So mitigation dollars going directly into operations or preferably infrastructure enhancements so that it's easier with those dollars. And you see states engaging in statewide activities. I'm going to go back to California again, but Project Home Key in California was one where state funding was set aside to purchase motels, hotels, and turn them into affordable housing. And so, quick strategies to create more affordable housing, and those are at the state level. But perhaps the biggest sea change in the U.S. right now is that states are revoking the authority that they've given to locals to control zoning. So the states enable locals to zone, and what the state giveth, the state can take away. And that's happening far and wide. I think I have a slide about this. Just really quickly wanted to talk about what's happened in California recently, where over the last 5 years, a discussion has been happening about the restrictive local zoning policies that preclude multifamily development, market rate or affordable, in much of California, and particularly in high opportunity locations, and many of those near transit. And so the state has, the legislature has put forward a number of bills, discussed them, and this year passed and will implement in January a bill that basically eliminates commercial-only zoning along corridors and allows for density that is graduated based on the scale of that road and the presence of transit. So around transit, you have the highest state-granted density allowances that basically ignore, in many regards, what the local policies say. So we'll see how many lawsuits this generates. But this is showing you some analysis that we did of the zoning in two major transit-served regions, the Bay Area and Los Angeles, and you can see just how much more of the Bay Area has single-family only zoning near transit. So these are high-capacity busways and rail station areas, and how much more in the Bay Area is non-residential. And this is partly driven by the fact that the city of Los Angeles already passed its own transit-oriented communities policy that upzoned most areas around transit, and in doing so, put in place some inclusionary zoning requirements and some other policies that lead to equitable TOD outcomes. And so their zoning was already more permissive than the Bay Area's. And this sea change, I think, is beyond California. We have Oregon and other states that have implemented and are now exploring state action on zoning around transit in particular.
Great. Question?
Another question from the virtual attendees. What about incentivizing nonprofit developers such as Habitat for Humanity?
So, I can speak maybe from the partnership side. I think transit agencies are always looking for opportunities like partnerships with nonprofits like Habitat for Humanity. I think one of the things we've discovered in our process of kind of reimagining or relaunching our JD TOD program is there's a lot of organizations in our region with the same goals as us around equitable TOD, and oftentimes we're not talking. So that's something that we're looking to change, and I think looking forward to talking with organizations like Habitat for Humanity.
Go ahead.
I'll say in our area, I think one challenge with Habitat is that, from what I've seen, they mostly do single family. construction. So most of our TOD sites, we're trying to sort of upzone and increase the density. So that would be a difficult partnership. But if there are a nonprofit multifamily developers, I think that would be something that would be of interest and probably is happening.
Something that Miami-Dade County does is if they have surplus land that's county-owned, a nonprofit can apply with an unsolicited bid for that land, and it will not trigger an additional RFP, public procurement process. So they're they get the direct line to site control to develop, which I think is a great incentive for nonprofit developers. Oftentimes, we as a private developer are in a partnership with a nonprofit developer. So they're the majority owner, and we work together. They help us get site control of public-owned land, and then we're helping to bring guarantees to the table to get the most optimal financing to get the buildings built. Good question. So I think we wanted to talk a little bit about the LCI in Atlanta.
Oh, sure. Go one slide. Thank you. So from the regional standpoint and from an MPO, we have actually had a program. It's actually 20 years old, called the Livable Centers Initiative. It's the classic 80-20 match for small area plans. And I think what was unique about it is that we actually convinced the federal government to allow us to use federal highway funds for, give or take, land use planning in walkable areas, and specifically surface transportation block grant funds. And as long as the small area or land use plan is used to increase different modes of transportation, walking, biking, and transit, they've allowed us to do these studies. So what we do now, we have $2 million a year for studies and then $20 million a year for infrastructure projects. And in the end, 70% of those projects have some sort of direct connection to transit. The Edgewood Candler Park example that I discussed earlier, that was actually an LCI study that transferred into a charrette. And then after MARTA started construction, they came back and accessed that $20 million in infrastructure funds, not the full $20 million, but they were able to do some infrastructure projects around that site to make sure the walkability was correct and to further subsidize the construction. So that's been a success, and now the board actually just made a decision that going forward, all of these small area studies, and we've done a lot of them, but a lot of them still need to be updated because now they're older. They either have to be within an existing older town center or main street or at a station area. So all of the efforts going forward are going to focus on walkable areas or our major transit stations. And I think as BRT comes online and becomes more popular going forward, it'll be interesting to see how some of these plans play out. But that is one of our major programs, is to study, and then the projects tied to it that have really kept interest in the project, and we have funded a lot of transit-related work through that.
And I just want to say, Houston has a very similar program, also called the Livable Centers Initiative. I don't know who was first, but it sounds, it's very similar to what you're describing.
Yeah.
And we have a lot of they're called tax increment reinvestment zones, and we also have management districts. Sometimes they're the same thing. A lot of times they are the ones that are, the plan is for their area. It's facilitated through the MPO, which is HGAC in Houston. And they do a lot of these, and in recent years, it's definitely been trending more towards, you're seeing a lot of conversation about equitable TOD. Maybe they don't always say that term, but there's a lot of recommendations that come out of those plans related to that. So, and some of those, because the studies are done through these TERSs and management districts who have funding to do those type of things, affordable housing, transportation investments, it's been a very successful and popular planning initiative.
Another tool we have here in Miami-Dade County is what's called the Documentary Surtax Program, where we charge a surtax on every real estate transaction through the documentary stamps, and that's set aside specifically to fund affordable rentals and home ownership. And a lot of the money that's set aside for multifamily rental is prioritized for transit-oriented development just based on the scoring system. So that's been a major, major source of getting some of these, TODs off the ground when we need that additional, mezzanine and gap debt to build up a capital stack.
And I'll add that some regions are also using more flexible funds than federal dollars to fund engagement. So you have, for example, in Portland, the regional government there is given grants to community groups to lead tables discussing equitable development along corridors that are slated for future transportation investments. And those groups are coming together to discuss well in advance of the engineers designing things, what the designs could do, what they could look like. And that means that discussions about community needs happen before you have engineers on a timetable driven by FTA working to meet a NEPA deadline, and you have time and room and space for that conversation to play out, for needs that go well beyond a transit project to be elevated. So if it's about safety, it's about housing, it's about these other things, then you don't have, apologies to all the engineers in there, but you don't have a transit engineer sitting and leading the conversation about housing or about public safety. And so that's an important thing that regions can do for these areas that are going to be subject to projects of regional importance.
Great. So we have just a little bit of time left, and I don't know if there's anything else on the policy level, whether it's city or otherwise, that we want to share. And then I do want to invite the audience to, ask any last questions you may have or contribute examples from your areas.
On the local level, I'll just say, under the current administration, the city of Houston has been, pushing affordability and equitable TOD for several years now. And so while that may be temporary policy, a lot of the programs in place have legs. And to somebody's comment earlier about how do you change the conversation, I think, at least in part, the leadership from the city of Houston has changed the conversation in our area about equitable TOD.
Great. Any parting questions or comments from attendees, analog or digital? Any final remarks from panel members?
I can't stand silence, so I will just say, given a platform, I think that we need to have a discussion about people-based versus place-based activities, and we have a lot of restrictions on what we can do with people-based programs, and yet people are the objective here, and yet we end up having to shape our policies around places. And so we have people who are working hard to identify places that are, for example, there are populations that are disproportionately underrepresented, people of color, communities of color, and that can miss the mark because that community might be a displaced community, and the place that that community calls home may not be where they live today. It may be a place that gentrified long ago. It may be a place from which they were displaced from a highway program 2 generations ago. And yet we have a public policy that, with the best of intentions, identifies where communities of color live today and tries to address those locations. And there's many other pitfalls to these place-based policies that I think we need to watch out for. And we need to continue a conversation about how we can direct federal funds specifically to historically impacted communities.
We're seeing that shift at the agency level as well, and I think it'll start to happen. Well, shameless plug, if you want to get more in the weeds on some of the stuff I talked about, our TOD director at MARTA will be talking about ground leases tomorrow, I think around 10 o'clock as well. So I had to get her permission to talk about this, but that'll be tomorrow.
I also just want to give a shameless plug. The next session at 3:30, if you want to learn more about how we're updating our policy, you can find, I think it's called TOD policy, not one size fits all.
Great. Well, thank you everybody for participating. Thank you panelists. Enjoyed the conversation.